Imagine, um, imagine an architect hands you a blueprint, and, it is just
It's
breathtaking.
like a masterpiece.
Exactly. I mean, the lines are perfect, the vision is deeply compassionate, and the promise structure looks like this absolute paradise where everyone has enough.
Sounds pretty ideal.
It does. But every time builders try to actually construct it, whether it is in Russia in the 1920s or, say, China in the 1950s or Cambodia in the 1970s, the roof completely collapses and it crushes millions of people inside.
Yeah, over and over again.
Right. So at what point do you stop blaming the builders for misunderstanding the plans and realize that, well, maybe the blueprint itself is fundamentally designed to collapse?
That is honestly the defining question of the 20th century. I mean, when the death toll of a single ideological framework reaches into the tens of millions, and we're talking across completely different cultures, different continents, different decades,
Hmm.
you just, you can no longer write it off as an anomaly.
No, you really can't.
You have to evaluate the foundational engineering of the ideology itself.
Well, welcome to this Deep Dive. Today, we are speaking directly to you. That means the pastors, the lay leaders, the campus ministers, and the apologists who are tuning in right now.
Because you are on the front lines of some profoundly heavy cultural and theological conversations, right?
Hmm?
And you need robust historical and philosophical tools to navigate them.
Absolutely. So today's deep dive is really designed as a masterclass. We are going to be examining the ideological and historical collision between Marxist theory and the Christian worldview.
And for this, we are drawing our analysis from a pair of really extensive briefing documents. They're from the AP212 apologetics series.
Yeah, these documents are incredibly detailed.
They are. They provide this rigorous dissection of communism, of dialectical materialism, and what the text referred to as the staggering cost of state atheism. Our goal today is to impartially unpack the arguments presented in these Christian apologetic sources. We want to trace exactly how they deconstruct Marxist philosophy from a theological perspective.
And to be super clear up front, we are just analyzing the anatomy of a specific apologetic argument here.
Right. We are not taking sides.
Exactly. We are not here to endorse a modern political party or take secular political sides at all. We are just here to report on the ideas contained in this source material and to evaluate how they build their case for the Christian faith when faced with these secular utopian ideologies.
Because we want to give you, the listener, the theological vocabulary to address the skepticism you actually encounter in your ministries.
So let's dive right in and start where you probably encounter this most often. On the street, in everyday conversation.
Yeah, the cultural myths.
Right. There is this cultural myth that you, as a ministry leader, have undoubtedly heard. Maybe from a college student or a young professional or even just a seasoned skeptic in your congregation.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Yeah. It is the myth that true communism has never actually been tried.
Right. It is arguably the most resilient political myth of the modern era, honestly.
Really is.
And the script always sounds completely identical. It's like, on paper, communism is a beautiful, compassionate theory about sharing resources, eliminating greed, ending poverty.
And the dictators just ruined it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Stalins, the Maos, the Pol Pots, they just corrupted a beautiful idea. And the AP212 documents dedicate significant space to this specific objection because, well, it appeals to a very genuine, very human desire for justice.
Yeah, that's a great point.
When someone in your congregation voices this, they're usually looking at real societal pain. I mean, they are observing wealth inequality or corporate greed or systemic poverty, and they are just desperate for a solution.
And the sources are very careful to validate that desire for justice. I mean, it is a righteous desire, but they also offer a really profound pushback using the historical track record.
Right. Going back to your blueprint analogy.
Yes. If the architect's blueprint results in a collapsed roof in every single environment it is tested in, we have to ask why. Why does this specific ideology continually attract such tyrannical operators?
A fair question.
I read through these documents and just thought, if the theory is so inherently compassionate, why does it always fail in the exact same catastrophic authoritarian way?
Well, the briefing documents provide a highly effective diagnostic tool to answer that exact question. They do this by contrasting two foundational views of the human condition.
Okay, unpack that.
It comes down to the system versus the heart. The texts categorize the foundational Marxist assumption as the utopian delusion.
The utopian delusion, wow. That phrase implies a hyper-optimistic, almost, naive view of human nature.
It does. It suggests a belief that we are born as blank slates, or even inherently good, and it is only the external environment that taints us.
Which is pretty much the core philosophical engine of the theory, right?
Exactly. Marxism operates on the assumption that human greed and selfishness and that desire to exploit others, well, they are exclusively the byproducts of the capitalist economic system.
So the system is the only problem.
Right. Marx essentially believed that human nature is almost infinitely malleable. So the logic dictates that if you just radically alter the economic environment specifically by eliminating private property and class divisions, you will fundamentally change the human heart.
You'll just engineer the greed right out of them.
Yeah, you will engineer a new, inherently unselfish type of human being who works solely for the collective good.
But, I mean, this entirely bypasses the Christian doctrine of original sin.
Totally ignores this.
Because if you assume the problem of evil is exclusively external, located just in the system, then your salvation narrative becomes purely political. You genuinely believe you can cure humanity just by rearranging the furniture of the state.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Right, because the Christian worldview operates on a completely inverted diagnostic tool. The root problem is not external at all, it is internal. The human heart is fallen.
Selfishness, pride, greed, those are indigenous to the human condition. It doesn't matter who owns the means of production.
No, it doesn't.
And if you consider the disastrous implications of the utopian delusion when it's actually applied to governance, I mean, it's terrifying.
How so?
Well, to implement this new classless economic system, you require a centralized state with absolute unchecked power. They need total control over all resources, agriculture, and human capital.
So you hand all the keys over to a small group of people.
Yes. The architects of this system hand total control to central planners. And they do this under the incredibly naive assumption that the new economic system will somehow purge these leaders of their own selfish ambition.
Which obviously creates an environment with absolutely zero accountability. I mean, you have concentrated infinite power into the hands of finite, fallen humans, all while actively denying that they are fallen in the first place.
It's like designing a bridge without calculating for gravity.
That's a perfect way to put it. You build a system that ignores the stress load of human depravity.
Yeah.
And the result is that corrupt human nature just runs completely wild, masked by all this high-minded rhetoric about public welfare.
This is exactly where the AP212 documents provide highly tactical advice for the pastor or lay leader listening right now.
Okay, let's get into that.
Because when you are sitting across from a young believer who is enamored with Marxist theory, mainly because of its promises of equality, you cannot simply throw theological jargon at them or, dismiss their genuine concerns about poverty.
You're right. That will just shut them down.
Exactly. So the sources provide a very specific conversational framework.
Let's actually model that framework, because I think this is vital for the leaders listening. I will play the role of the frustrated college student in your ministry.
Sounds good.
So I sit down in your office and I say, look, I see the poverty in our city. I see executives making millions while their workers can't even afford rent. Communism at least offers a vision where everyone is equal and provided for. It's just that bad people in history ruin the implementation. So how does the source material instruct you to respond to me?
Well, the script begins with aggressive validation of the motive. Right. I would say, I hear you, and I totally agree that the severe wealth inequality and systemic poverty we see is heartbreaking. Your desire for a society where everyone is cared for is actually a reflection of God's heart for the vulnerable.
Okay, so you establish common ground on the desire for justice. As the student, my defenses are immediately lowered. I feel heard, I'm not being attacked as some radical.
Exactly. And then comes the pivot. The sources guide the leader to gently introduce the historical track record, but through a question.
Okay, let's hear the question.
I would ask, have you ever wondered why every single time a state tried to implement this beautiful theory, whether in the snowy plains of Russia or the agrarian fields of Cambodia or the islands of Cuba, it immediately and consistently resulted in mass executions, secret police, and totalitarian control?
Yeah.
Like, if the theory is purely compassionate, why does it continually attract and empower tyrants?
Wow. Okay, so as a student, I might retreat to my original defense and say, well, Stalin and Mao were just power hungry. They didn't practice real Marxism.
And that is exactly where you introduce the Christian doctrine of sin, not as this abstract theology, but as the only logical explanation for the historical data.
Right, you make it practical.
I would reply, perhaps the problem isn't just that bad people hijacked a good system. Perhaps the problem is that the theory itself completely misunderstands human nature.
That's a great pivot.
Christianity teaches that greed isn't caused by money, Greed is a sickness in the human heart. If you eliminate God and you give a few government leaders absolute control over all food, land, and resources in an attempt to force equality, you haven't cured human selfishness at all.
You've just weaponized it.
Right. You've just given the most ruthless, selfish people limitless power with zero accountability.
That fundamentally shifts the entire paradigm of the conversation. I mean, you take a tense political debate and you skillfully transform it into this really profound discussion about the human condition, the reality of sin, and the urgent need for internal transformation over mere external regulation.
It works so well because it addresses the root, not just the symptom.
But, to truly dismantle this myth of the beautiful blueprint, the sources argue we have to go deeper than just surface-level history. We have to look at the actual ink used to draw these plans.
The foundational philosophy.
Exactly. We move from the street into the academy. We must examine the metaphysical and anthropological bedrock of the ideology.
And the AP212 documents are completely uncompromising on this point. They argue that you cannot adequately defend the Christian worldview against Marxism without understanding dialectical materialism.
Which sounds like a mouthful, but it's crucial.
It is. Because communism is not merely an economic theory about taxation and labor. It is a totalizing, comprehensive worldview. It seeks to answer every fundamental question about human existence.
So let's break down dialectical materialism for the listener. Let's start with the noun, materialism.
Okay, materialism.
In philosophical terms, the documents explain that materialism is the dogmatic assertion that matter is the fundamental, absolute, and only reality in the universe.
Meaning, nothing exists outside the physical.
Right. There is no spiritual realm. There is no soul. There are no angels. There is no God. And crucially, there is no transcendent moral law governing the universe.
Which changes everything.
It does. It means every human thought, every act of love, every religious impulse, every cultural milestone is ultimately just the byproduct of atoms colliding and material environments shaping biological organisms.
That is the foundation. That's the materialism part.
Yes.
Then we add the adjective, dialectical.
Yeah.
The sources point out that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels heavily borrowed this from the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Right, Hegelian dialectics.
Exactly. Hegel popularized the concept of the dialectic, which is basically the idea that history is not static. It is driven forward by conflict.
Okay, conflict.
Hegel argued that history moves through a process where a dominant idea, he called that the thesis, is challenged by its exact opposite, the antithesis.
Thesis and antithesis.
Right. And this violent clash of ideas eventually produces a new, higher state of reality, which is the synthesis.
But here's the catch, right? Hegel was an idealist. He believed history was driven by the clash of ideas or spiritual forces.
Yes, very different from Marx.
Right, because Marx looked at Hegel's engine of history. He kept the mechanism of conflict, but he completely discarded the spiritual component. Marx just inverted it. He argued that ideas don't drive history. Matter and economics drive history.
It all comes back to the material.
Exactly. The clash is not between abstract philosophies. It is a brutal material conflict between classes.
The exploiters versus the exploited. Those who own the means of production, the land, the factories, the resources, locked in an inevitable historical war against those who just provide the labor.
And for Marx, all of human history, all culture, art, law, it can all be reduced to this single material struggle.
Which brings us to the ideology's view of religion, which is a really vital section for our pastoral audience to understand. The briefing document highlights Marx's very famous quote from 1844.
Oh, the opium quote.
Right. And it is essential to read this in full to grasp the worldview. The text says, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people.
That phrase, the opium of the people, is frequently cited, but I feel like it's rarely analyzed in its full context.
No, it's not. But the sources do an excellent job dissecting what Marx actually meant by that.
So what did he mean?
In his framework, religion was viewed as a psychological narcotic. It was seen as an artificial construct manufactured entirely by the ruling class.
For what purpose?
Its sole purpose was to keep the exploited working class docile and submissive.
I see. The logic goes like this. If you are a peasant suffering under just crushing labor, and the ruling class can somehow convince you that in doing this injustice will earn you an eternal golden paradise in the afterlife, well, you will tolerate the abuse.
Exactly. You will take the narcotic of religion to numb the pain of your miserable existence, rather than rising up and violently overthrowing your oppressors to claim your paradise here and now.
Therefore, the Marxist project views religion not just as some silly superstition, but as an active, hostile threat to human liberation.
It is the ultimate enemy of progress.
Right. To truly free humanity, you cannot merely restructure the economy. You must systematically annihilate the illusion of religion, because religion neutralizes revolutionary zeal.
But there is a massive problem with this theory, isn't there?
Oh, a glaring historical contradiction, and the Christian apologetic texts point this out beautifully. I mean, if religion is merely a narcotic designed by the powerful to manufacture submission and preserve the status quo, how do we account for the sheer disruptive, revolutionary resilience of the early Christian church?
You can't. That is the gaping hole in the materialist theory of religion. It fails entirely when applied to the historical data of the first 3 centuries of Christianity.
Think about the Roman Empire. The Caesar was the ultimate ruling class, demanding absolute allegiance and worship.
The ultimate oppressor in that framework.
Right. And the early Christians were certainly not sitting around being docile cogs for the Roman elite. They were this grassroots movement comprised heavily of slaves, of women, and the completely impoverished.
People with zero institutional power.
Exactly. And they looked at the greatest military empire on earth and declared Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not.
Which was treason.
Absolute treason. And they paid for it. They were thrown to the lions. They were crucified. They had to hide in the catacombs. They lost their property and their lives.
That does not describe a painkiller designed for submissiveness.
Not at all. That describes the most dangerous, uncontainable, revolutionary conviction in the ancient world.
It was profoundly disruptive. But, crucially, the sources note that it was a disruption rooted in love and transcendent truth, not material conflict.
Yes, a huge distinction.
The early church ultimately transformed the Roman Empire and outlasted it entirely, not by seizing the means of production through violence, but through a willingness to suffer for a reality higher than the state.
Marx's theory is just incapable of explaining a movement that willingly suffers for a truth that brings absolutely zero material or economic benefit to its adherents.
It breaks his entire dialectical model. And this foundational flaw in understanding religion leads directly to what the documents call the architectural flaw of communism.
The anthropological chasm.
Yes, the sources lay out this comprehensive clash between 2 completely incompatible definitions of what a human being actually is.
And if you're listening, this is arguably the most vital section of the AP212 documents for a Christian leader to grasp.
Definitely.
We are contrasting Marxist anthropology with Christian anthropology. So let's start with the Marxist side. In a strictly materialist framework, how are humans defined?
Exclusively as units of state utility.
Still units of state utility. Wow, that just reduces the majesty of human existence to the level of, I don't know, livestock or machinery.
But that is the logical necessity of materialism, because if there is no God, there is no divine spark, there is no soul, and there is no transcendent moral law granting intrinsic human rights.
Right, so where does your value come from?
In that system, your value as a human being is derived entirely from your economic output and your contribution to the collective synthesis of society. The individual is entirely expendable for the greater good of the collective.
Compare that with the breathtaking beauty of Christian anthropology, which the documents anchor in the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God.
It's night and day.
It really is. The Christian worldview argues that human value is inherent, it is divine, and it is unalienable. It is given by the Creator, not assigned by the state.
Therefore, the individual possesses eternal, transcendent worth, regardless of their economic utility, their physical health, their intelligence, or their social class.
The implications of this distinction are just staggering. When you define a human being merely as a biological cog in a grand economic machine, the boundaries of social engineering completely vanish.
They absolutely disappear.
Because think about it, if a factory machine has a defective cog, you do not weep over the cog.
No, you don't.
You don't draft a bill of rights to protect the cog. You extract it, discard it, and replace it so the machine can continue functioning.
Right. And in a materialist worldview, if an individual or an entire class of people honestly does not fit the central economic plan, or if they actively oppose the state apparatus, well, they're not persons with sacred worth.
They are merely defective parts slowing down the utopian machine.
Exactly. They are debris on the tracks of historical progress. And clearing debris is not considered murder. It is considered necessary maintenance.
It's chilling when you put it like that. And this devaluation of the human person is inextricably linked to the crisis of epistemology, how a society determines what is actually true.
The AP212 documents analyze this profound problem of authority and truth in a godless system.
We see a stark contrast here again. The Christian foundation roots ultimate authority and objective truth in the unchanging nature of a transcendent God and his revealed word.
Whereas the Marxist reliance is placed entirely on the state, or mankind collectively.
Which means when you remove a transcendent creator from the equation, you just evaporate any objective standard for truth or morality.
Truth ceases to be an absolute reality that we must discover and submit to. Instead, truth becomes entirely subjective, totally malleable, and ultimately it's just whatever serves the political ends of the state at any given moment.
The briefing documents bring up the terrifying Soviet practice of rewriting history to prove this point. It's the phenomenon George Orwell famously categorized as the memory hole.
Yes, the memory hole.
Without an objective standard, history itself is weaponized. So if a high-ranking official fell out of favor with Joseph Stalin, they didn't simply lose their position or face a trial.
No, it was much more thorough than that.
They were systematically airbrushed out of official state photographs. Their writings were burned. Their existence was literally deleted from the official record.
Because in a purely naturalistic system, history is not a sacred record of objective facts occurring under God's sovereignty. History is just another raw material to be molded and manipulated by those in power to control the masses.
If the past contradicts the current narrative of the state, well, the past is simply erase.
Which inevitably leads to a profound crisis of meaning. The sources reference the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre here.
Sartre was a fascinating figure in this context.
He was. Sartre was a Marxist, and as an atheistic existentialist, he concluded that because there is no God, the universe is inherently absurd, silent, and devoid of any intrinsic meaning.
Right.
Therefore, he argued, human beings are condemned to be free. We have to frantically manufacture our own meaning through our choices. And for Sartre, that meant engaging in radical political revolution.
But the AP212 texts offer a really brilliant critique of this. They argue that attempting to manufacture ultimate meaning through political systems in a godless universe is just the ultimate exercise in self-delusion.
It is.
Because if the universe is truly a closed material system grinding slowly toward eventual heat death and cosmic silence, then any political utopia you manage to build, even if it lasted 1,000 years, is ultimately temporary, microscopic, and utterly meaningless in the grand scope of eternity.
To pretend that statecraft provides transcendent meaning is to basically lie to yourself, to stave off nihilism.
I picture this epistemological crisis like trying to secure a massive cargo ship in the middle of a violent hurricane. The Christian worldview takes its anchor and drops it past the raging waters, sinking it deep into the solid, immovable seabed of God's transcendent, eternal reality.
And the ship holds fast.
Exactly. But the Marxist framework, having denied that the seabed even exists, attempts to tie the anchor of absolute truth and human meaning to a floating piece of driftwood on the surface of the water.
Wow.
And that driftwood is the shifting, temporary, constantly changing will of the state. The ship is guaranteed to crash because you simply cannot anchor absolute moral truth to a temporary material authority.
And the tragic reality is that this philosophical bankruptcy did not remain confined to academic textbooks or philosophy debates.
No. Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have devastating casualties.
The documents transition from the academy to the historical arena here, insisting that Christian apologists must be completely fluent in the raw historical data to demonstrate the practical consequences of state atheism.
This is where the weight of this deep dive becomes incredibly heavy. When a society adopts state atheism and builds its foundation on that driftwood, what is the mathematical historical result?
The sources cite data from the Black Book of Communism, which is a comprehensive academic text published by Harvard University Press.
And what does the data reveal?
It reveals that explicitly atheistic Marxist regimes claim the lives of an estimated 85 to 100 million human beings in the 20th century alone.
85 to 100 million lives. It is a number so vast that the human mind just struggles to comprehend the sheer volume of suffering it represents.
It's almost numbing. But it is vital that we do not rush past this data. We must examine the specific examples the documents provide to understand how the philosophy actually authorized the brutality.
Right. Let's walk through the historical record carefully. The text begins with the Soviet Union. Under Vladimir Lenin and subsequently Joseph Stalin, the state didn't merely promote secularism. They launched explicit, aggressive campaigns literally titled the Godless 5-Year Plans.
The Godless 5-Year Plans.
Yes.
This was the systematic, violent eradication of religion. They executed tens of thousands of Orthodox priests, monks, and nuns. They closed, desecrated, or physically detonated thousands of churches.
But the violence extended far beyond just the clergy. It culminated in atrocities like the Holodomor in the early 1930s.
The terror famine.
Right. Millions of Ukrainian peasants were deliberately starved to death by the state. This wasn't a natural drought. The Soviet leadership enforced impossible grain requisitions to break the resistance of independent farmers who didn't want state collectivization.
And armed cadres went from house to house, confiscating not just grain, but vegetables, seeds, literally any means of survival.
And the psychological conditioning of those perpetrators is terrifying. They were taught by the state that these farmers, these kulaks, were class enemies. They were obstacles to the utopian synthesis.
So in their minds, they weren't doing anything wrong.
Exactly. Watching children starve in the streets wasn't viewed as a moral atrocity. It was viewed as a necessary scientific step toward the perfect society.
And we see the exact same philosophical engine operating in Mao's China.
During the Great Leap Forward.
Yes, and the subsequent Cultural Revolution. The state sought to entirely overwrite the cultural DNA of the nation by eradicating what they called the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas.
Complete erasure.
This campaign of enforced ideological purity, combined with catastrophic centralized agricultural planning, resulted in the state-sanctioned deaths of an estimated 45 to 60 million people.
Unbelievable.
Families were torn apart, historical artifacts were smashed, and intellectuals were publicly humiliated and beaten to death by radicalized youth who truly believed they were birthing a new world.
And the logic reaches its most concentrated, horrifying extreme with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia.
Pol Pot.
Yes, Pol Pot and his leadership cadre, many of whom, by the way, were educated in Marxist philosophy in Paris, attempted to reset society entirely to year zero.
Year zero, meaning everything before this point is gone.
Erased. They evacuated the cities at gunpoint, marching millions into agrarian labor camps, the infamous killing fields, and they systematically executed anyone perceived as a threat to the radical collective.
Military officers, religious believers, teachers.
Even individuals who simply wore glasses.
Just wearing glasses.
Yes, because wearing glasses implied you could read, which made you an intellectual, which made you an enemy of the agrarian utopia. They exterminated nearly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population in a matter of years.
It is the ultimate, unfiltered expression of that biological cog anthropology we talked about. If humanity is nothing more than raw material for state utility, and the architects decide the machine needs a complete recalibration, you simply discard millions of the broken units without a second thought.
To bring this staggering abstract horror down to an intimate, personal reality, the briefing documents introduce the harrowing testimony of Richard Wurmbrand.
Wurmbrand's story is incredible.
It really is. He was a Romanian Christian minister who spent 13 agonizing years in communist prisons, enduring unimaginable torture for his faith.
His inclusion in the AP212 documents is essential, honestly. His first-hand testimony exposes the direct, unvarnished collision between Christian moral realism and state-sponsored atheism.
What did he observe specifically about their mindset?
Well, he articulated that the denial of God and the afterlife doesn't just change economic policy. It actively and aggressively removes all moral restraints from the human conscience.
Because if there is no God watching in the dark, and there is no final judgment where the scales of justice will be balanced, then the concepts of right and wrong are entirely fabricated.
Anything goes.
Exactly. Wurmbrand witnessed how this nihilistic philosophy directly unleashed the unbelievable brutality inside those prison walls. The torturers would explicitly mock the concept of God while inflicting pain.
They knew exactly what they were doing.
They did. They would tell the prisoners that because God was dead and heaven was a myth, the guards were the absolute, unquestioned masters of the prisoners' universe. They could do whatever they wanted, and no one would ever hold them accountable.
This leads to the most chilling philosophical synthesis in the entire briefing document. The sources argue forcefully that these historical atrocities, the gulags of Siberia, the orchestrated famine of the Holodomor, the blood-soaked killing fields of Cambodia, they were not accidental deviations from Marxist theory.
They were not just well-intentioned plans that got out of hand.
Right. They were not a glitch in the matrix.
Precisely. They were the logical, inevitable evolution of materialism applied to statecraft.
If there is no final accountability to a transcendent creator, and if human beings possess no inherent sacred dignity, then sacrificing tens of millions of individuals for the promised greater good of a future utopia is not considered a crime.
In their materialist framework, it is just applied science. It is social engineering.
That is a deeply sobering realization. And the documents point out one final, glaring reality regarding the implementation of these regimes: the historically demonstrated hypocrisy of the leadership.
Oh, the text refers to it as the noble lie.
Yes, the leadership maintained an iron grip on social order by constantly preaching absolute equality and shared sacrifice to the masses. Yet the Politburos and the party elites lived in absolute luxury,
Utilizing special stores, private hospitals, lavish dachas.
entirely insulated from the crushing poverty they inflicted on their own citizens.
It proves the foundational critique of the Christian worldview. The system didn't cure the selfish human heart. It merely provided the most ruthless, selfish hearts with unlimited power and an ideological camouflage.
The utopian delusion always collapses in on itself, crushing the very people it promised to liberate.
Well, we have walked through the everyday street objections, and we have waded deep into the heavy, tragic historical and philosophical ruins of the academy. But this masterclass must ultimately serve the local church.
That's why we're here.
Right. We must pivot to your daily reality as ministry leaders. We land now in the pulpit. How does a pastor, a lay leader, or a counselor take this intense academic data and translate it into shepherding a modern congregation?
This transition into homiletical application is where the AP212 documents become immensely practical. The texts acknowledge a growing reality in our churches today.
Which is what?
Well, modern cultural movements frequently borrow the Marxist language of systemic power struggles, oppressor versus oppressed dynamics, and class consciousness, while completely discarding the biblical parameters for justice.
Let's examine a specific pastoral scenario outlined in the sources, because this is something leaders will definitely face.
Okay, set the scene.
Imagine you are leading a small group or teaching a Sunday school class of passionate young adults. They are vocal about systemic oppression, corporate greed, and the crushing weight of modern economics.
Very common.
They have been reading secular political theory, and they are beginning to view the traditional church as a conservative barrier to true social progress. And then they open their Bibles to the book of Acts, and they think they've found the ultimate trump card.
The Acts chapter 2 argument. It is an apologetic challenge that every single pastor must be equipped to answer.
Right. They point specifically to Acts 2.4445, which describes the early believers in Jerusalem. The text says, "And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need."
And they look at you and say,
They look at you and say, look right here in the text. The early uncorrupted church practiced communism. This is biblical proof that Marxism is actually the Christian ideal.
It sounds incredibly compelling on the surface.
Yeah.
Which is exactly why the briefing documents provide a brilliant exegetical strategy for untangling the events of Acts 2 for the horrors of state coercion.
So what's the critical distinction that must be drawn here?
It all comes down to the mechanism behind the generosity. We must thoroughly unpack this. What is the massive theological and structural difference between the communal living of the early church in Jerusalem and 20th century state communism?
Okay, what is it?
The generosity exhibited by the early church was radically, fundamentally voluntary. It was driven by an overwhelming love for Christ and a profound, spirit-led compassion for their brothers and sisters in the faith.
Crucially, it was not mandated, orchestrated, or enforced by a centralized, coercive state apparatus.
Exactly. And the sources bring in Acts chapter 5 to definitively prove this point. This is the infamous story of Ananias and Sapphira.
Right. They sell a piece of property, keep some of the money for themselves, but lie to the apostles, claiming they are donating the full amount.
Yes. And before God judges Ananias, the apostle Peter confronts him. Peter's words here are absolutely vital. He says, "While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal?"
Peter is explicitly affirming the concepts of private property and voluntary agency.
He is telling Ananias, you didn't have to sell the land. And once you sold it, you didn't have to give us all the money.
So the fatal sin of Ananias and Sapphira was not that they violated some mandatory economic collective.
Not at all. Their sin was hypocrisy and deceit. They lied to the Holy Spirit in an attempt to manufacture a false image of extreme holiness.
I want to deliver a specific quote directly from the AP212 source document because it is perhaps the most powerful, clarifying contrast in the entire briefing. I encourage every pastor listening to write this down.
Let's hear it.
The text says, one says, "What is mine is yours because I love you." The other says, "What is yours is mine because I have a gun."
Wow. That is a phenomenal, piercing summary of the distinction.
It perfectly captures the chasm between the two worldviews. Marxist communism attempts to violently replace the internal transformative conviction of the Holy Spirit with the external, terrifying coercion of a state security apparatus.
One is a beautiful, organic expression of regenerated hearts sacrificing for each other.
And the other is a terrifying expression of totalitarian force stripping individuals of their agency.
However, the sources are incredibly careful to issue a stern pastoral warning immediately following this point, ensuring that leaders do not overcorrect.
Right, this brings us to the section on reclaiming true biblical justice.
This is a crucial balancing act. The text cautions the listener. Do not let the legitimate fear of Marxist ideology turn your pulpit into a baptism of unbridled corporate greed or a defense of crony capitalism.
Just because communism is a catastrophic failure does not mean that every aspect of our current economic system perfectly aligns with the kingdom of God.
The apologist's job is to defend the Christian worldview, not to declare secular capitalism as flawlessly divine. The sources demand that preachers must still fiercely proclaim the words of the biblical prophets.
You cannot edit out the book of Amos, where God roars against those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth.
You cannot ignore Isaiah's condemnation of those who add house to house and field to field until there is no room left for the vulnerable.
And you must still preach the blistering warnings of James chapter 5, which condemns wealthy landowners who fraudulently withhold the wages of their laborers.
The Bible absolutely burns with a passion for economic justice and the care of the vulnerable, but the theological why behind that justice is entirely different from the secular why.
So why does the God of the Bible command such rigorous care for the poor?
Because the poor bear the imago Dei. They are not marginalized cogs in a cold economic machine. They are sacred image bearers of the Most High God, possessing infinite, inherent, and divine worth.
God demands justice because he loves the people he created.
Not to fulfill some blind, dialectical, materialist historical process.
This is the supreme irony, isn't it? Marxism claims to champion the oppressed, yet its foundational philosophy discards the very concept, the image of God, that makes human life sacred and worthy of protection.
Christianity demands justice precisely because human life is sacred. When you remove God from the equation, you don't liberate the poor, you remove the only transcendent shield protecting them from the powerful.
Which brings us to the ultimate regenerative solution offered by the Christian worldview.
The only real solution.
True social transformation cannot be achieved through the utopian delusions of a totalitarian state, and it certainly cannot be birthed through the bloody mechanisms of revolutionary violence.
Because, circling all the way back to our very first point on the street, the root problem is the human heart.
If you embrace the dialectic and violently overthrow the current oppressors, history proves that the formerly oppressed simply become the new oppressors.
The cycle of tyranny continues unabated because the underlying disease, human sin, remains untreated.
The theological fix, the only real and lasting change, requires the supernatural intervention of the Holy Spirit.
It requires God to fulfill the promise of Ezekiel, to surgically remove the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh.
It requires the spiritual regeneration that turns fiercely selfish individuals into radically sacrificial servants.
The state cannot perform a spiritual surgery. A Politburo cannot legislate greed out of existence. Only the Creator can remake the human heart.
I want to read the climactic quote from the text.
Yeah.
This is the overarching big idea that the AP212 documents offer for pastors to take directly to their congregations. Listen to the synthesis here.
Go ahead.
The early church changed the world by saying, "What is mine is yours because I love Jesus." Communism broke the world by saying, "What is yours is mine because I own the state." You cannot build a compassionate society by replacing the Holy Spirit with a security apparatus.
That quote is the ultimate synthesis of everything we have explored today.
It really is.
It bridges the tragic historical data, the profound philosophical bankruptcy of materialism, and the beautiful regenerative power of the Christian gospel. It provides a clear, undeniable contrast between a worldview of force and a worldview of grace.
It is incredibly powerful, and it equips the church to speak truth into a confused culture. Let's recap the immense journey we have taken today through these apologetic sources.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We began on the street, role-playing how to confront the skeptical myth that communism is just a beautiful blueprint ruined by bad builders. We discovered that the blueprint itself was fatally flawed, because it relied on the utopian delusion, completely ignoring the reality of original sin and the falling human heart.
We then descended into the academy, where we unpacked the philosophical machinery of dialectical materialism.
We saw how reducing human beings from sacred bearers of the Imago Dei to mere units of state utility destroyed the foundations of truth and meaning.
Which paved the way for the historical horrors of the 20th century. We looked unflinchingly at the data from the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and the Khmer Rouge, realizing that the deaths of tens of millions were not anomalies, but the grim, logical fruit of state atheism.
And finally, we return to the pulpit, discovering the restorative truth that true biblical justice is fiercely protective of the vulnerable because of the dignity of God's image.
We affirm that real lasting societal change only happens when the Holy Spirit transforms the human heart, moving us from coercion to sacrificial love.
Understanding this deepens our appreciation for the divine dignity God has placed in every single human being.
As we close this masterclass, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
Building on the foundation these apologetic sources have laid, think about this. If true social healing and lasting justice ultimately require the Holy Spirit to regenerate the selfish human heart rather than just rearranging political power and economic structures, how might this radically challenge the way modern Christians engage with any secular political system, movement, or party that promises utopian salvation through policy alone?
That is a phenomenal question to carry into your week. It challenges every believer to look beyond the temporary, shifting scaffolding of human governments and political saviors.
Because at the end of the day, no matter how perfectly the architect draws the lines on the paper,
if the blueprint relies on human perfection instead of divine grace, the roof is always going to collapse. Keep your trust anchored to the solid rock of Christ. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to take these insights, this historical data, and this rich theological truth into your ministries, your counseling, and your pulpits. We will see you on the next deep dive.